Global Water Policy, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Robert Ricigliano, Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM. With the world on the verge of an unprecedented water crisis, management of water resources has become a critical policy issue. Access to fresh water has profound implications for human health and food security and is a major driver of resource-based conflict. Yet few of the world's governments have adequately addressed the serious issues surrounding this finite and irreplaceable resource. Here, with an analysis of the global water crisis and potential policy responses, we're pleased to be joined by Sandra Postel, a leading authority on international freshwater issues and director of the Independent Global Water Policy Project. She also serves as a lead water expert for the National Geographic Society's Freshwater Initiative. Sandra, welcome to International Focus.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Sandra, I wonder if you could help us first put water in a global context. I mean, if you live in this part of the world, you see these huge lakes, you're thinking, hey, what's the big deal? Help us understand the importance of water globally.
Well, first of all, water is finite. It falls from the sky. We have the sense that it's, endless and renewable. And it is renewable, but only in a finite amount. And so the amount of water that comes to any particular place is the supply that's there to serve all those needs. And so as populations have grown, as we've seen the expansion of agriculture and cities around the world, there's a mismatch between where the people are and where the farming is and where the water is. And so in many parts of the world now, water is becoming very scarce. The demand exceeds the renewable supply that's there. And so we have a tension around how much is going to be there to meet all of these food needs, industrial needs, and urban needs into the future. And we already see quite a number of signs that we're unsustainable in how we're using and managing water to meet these demands. Rivers are running dry in many places. Groundwater tables are falling in many places. So very clear physical signs that we've got a problem.
And I mean, water. I mean, as you said, I mean, people. It's almost invisible to people because they see it every day, from when they get up in the morning and brush their teeth to when they go to bed. And what are the implications then if in parts of the world that access isn't there and it's not an invisible, plentiful resource, but is a finite and shrinking resource?
Well, a couple things. One is that most of the water that we're using goes to produce food. So 70% of all the water we extract from rivers, lakes, groundwater aquifers around the world goes to produce food. And so one of my concerns is, as industries expand and cities expand, where is the water going to come from to produce the food that everybody needs to eat? And so that's a big concern. And if you look at where these physical signs of unsustainability are, they're in some of the most important areas of irrigated agriculture, some very important food-producing regions. And so figuring out how we can meet that demand in a more sustainable way is really, really crucial. The other thing is, a lot of people today still don't have access to safe drinking water. Now, this is not a problem of physical water scarcity. It takes very little water to meet the basic needs we have for water at the household level. Maybe 50 liters of water per day for a basic needs water use around the world, but more than 1 billion people don't have access to that yet. And so that's a real concern. And then, of course, the sanitation even more, 2.6 billion people. So the basic needs need to be met, and a more sustainable way of using and managing the water for food production and industrial production and in our cities also needs to happen.
And there have been, I've seen people linking water and energy, or water and climate change directly. What are those links?
Very close links. If you think about climate change, the way we as a human civilization will experience climate change is largely through the water cycle. Droughts and more intense droughts, more flooding and more intense flooding, changes in the patterns of river flow, the recession of the glaciers, which will change the amount of water we have available during the spring, during the summer, more flooding in the spring, more dry spells in rivers in the summer when we need it for irrigation and hydropower. So we'll experience climate change, yes, through higher temperature, but also through these very fundamental changes in the water cycle, which will impact how we grow food and what water is available when we need it. So we very soon need to begin developing some very conscious ways of adapting to that and becoming more resilient to those kinds of changes.
At the intro, I talked about resource-based conflict and water being a center in a lot of those current and potentially future resource conflicts. When we look at water in the transboundary sense, I mean, how does water feed into potential conflict between countries?
Well, rivers flow, and they flow across political boundaries. And so we have more than 260 rivers around the world that flow through 2 or more countries. And in most cases, there's not yet a treaty that sets out how that water should be shared among the parties. In the case of the Nile, for example, there's a treaty between Egypt and Sudan, but there's no treaty that includes all of the countries that share the Nile, which are now 10 countries. And so as demands have increased and as competition for that water has increased, it's a concern that there's not yet a treaty in most of these cases that says how much each country should receive from that finite supply of water. And so to the extent there's competition, obviously tensions can arise. And even where you've got treaties now, because of changes in demand and changes in flows and glaciers receding and so on, there's concern that even in places where you have a treaty, including, importantly, between India and Pakistan, that the increased tensions could result in some, if not outright conflict, the kind of diplomatic tensions that can lead to other concerns and other problems.
So a lot of in thinking about water, it feels like there are the initial presenting problem, which is lack of access for some to water for drinking or water for sanitation, and then there are all these tentacles that seem to come out of that, right? It's all into energy and food and conflict. And you were mentioning changing how we cope with that. What are some of the ways that we are currently dealing with it that may not be sustainable into the future?
Well, we've had this, if you think about water from a historical standpoint, the basic approach we've had to developing water is to go out and build new sources of supply. So we've seen the number of large dams around the world, for example, increase from 5,000 in 1950 to 50,000 today, which means we've been building on average 1 large dam a day, every day, for half a century. Now this, it's helped for very legitimate reasons, generating hydropower, flood control, irrigation, water supply, but it's had a very dramatic impact on the health of the aquatic environment. And so part of the challenge we face now is figuring out how to meet these legitimate human demands for energy and food and drinking water, but also protecting the ecosystems that sustain everything. We think of water as a commodity, and it is, as is oil and copper, but water is fundamentally different. It's the basis of life. And so that is really the first principle, in my view, of managing water, is ensuring that we manage water as the basis of life for the continuation of human civilization, but also all of the myriad species that keep the planet humming. I mean, these are the ecosystems that we all depend on. And so that piece needs to be put in there. And so how we go into the future in managing water needs to have that fundamental ecosystem health criteria at the core of it, which when we do that, we'll discover that there are all kinds of ways we can increase our water productivity. And by water productivity, I mean how much benefit we get from every gallon of water we extract from the natural environment. And if we don't put a premium on keeping water in the natural ecosystems, then we don't use it as efficiently or as productively as we could. But once we realize that the true maximizing value of water is if we value it in its natural place, as well as when we take it out, there's all kinds of ways we can get more bang for the buck.
Say a little more about the sort of contrast you drew between how we manage, say, a resource like oil and water, in that we've largely had these sort of technological solutions to energy issues. So whether it's been to dig deeper wells or in other places, or substitute with solar or other means. And in some ways, I guess we've done that with water, in that we've built filtration plants and as you were saying, dams and maybe desalination plants. why can't we keep doing that? In other words, why can't we manage it in the way we've managed a resource like oil or energy?
A couple things. One big difference between water and oil is that water has no substitutes, right? We're not going to transition away from water to something else, the way we're transitioning away now from oil to wind and solar and other sources of energy. We can't transition away from water. What's here is all that's ever been, all that's ever going to be. So we have to learn to use that wisely. And you know, we're sort of maxing out on the sustainable ways we can tap into water by these big water projects, moving water around through big canals and dam systems, drilling deeper into groundwater. We already have, there's a new study out just last week that says between 1960 and 2000, the rate of groundwater depletion has doubled. And I translated that into the amount of food that water loss would produce, and it's over 900 million people that could be fed a subsistence diet with the water that we're depleting from groundwater, which means how are we going to meet the food needs in the future if we're already using some of tomorrow's water to meet today's food demands?
Well, that's an interesting concept. I've never thought about that we're basically mortgaging tomorrow's water.
It's a water
today.
debt. It's a form of water debt, and so we're, in a sense, we're using water unsustainably today to meet today's demands, which means it's going to be harder to meet tomorrow's demands, especially for food.
And as we think about this concept of water productivity, how does that work? I mean, if you're a government official or a mayor of a city or of a business owner or consumer, what does that mean?
It can mean a few things. The basic idea is getting more value out of each gallon of water that you're putting to use. And so if we think about agriculture, for example, a lot of farmers still irrigate the way farmers did centuries ago, by flooding their field, running it down furrows, letting gravity do the work, and it seeps into the soil. And much of it doesn't actually benefit a crop. And so to the extent we can improve the efficiency of irrigation, we're getting more value out of the water that's diverted out of natural ecosystems to farming. One way to do this, there are many ways to do it, but one way is, for example, through more use of a technology called drip irrigation, where you're delivering water through perforated tubing on or below the soil right to the crop's roots. And so you're reducing evaporation and getting more productivity out of that water. Very often the crops like it, so yield increases. And it's not uncommon to have a doubling of water productivity, getting twice the crop per drop, if you will, when you shift from these inefficient irrigation systems to something like drip irrigation. We've seen corporations now beginning to be concerned about their water footprint, which includes not only the water that they're using in, say, the manufacturing facility, in the factory, but also out in the field. If you're making tomato sauce, well, how are those tomatoes grown? Because that's where your biggest part of the water footprint is in the product grown in the field. So making coffee, making tea, making tomato sauce. So you find some corporations now going out and helping farmers irrigate more efficiently to reduce their footprint across the supply chain. And that kind of activity is going to become increasingly important for this, what I think is going to need to be a doubling of water productivity over the next 25 years.
We're up against our break, but let's come back to this question in just a moment. We'll be back in just a minute on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking with Sandra Postel of the Global Water Policy Project. Sandra, we began digging into this idea of water productivity going forward, and as a contrast to sort of the big water project approach of build a bigger dam or move the water across places, and you gave us an example of how that could happen with, say, irrigation, where we just improve the productivity of every drop of water we use to produce a certain crop. And you began kind of going into manufacturing and so the business sector. Can you talk more about what increasing water productivity would mean for businesses?
Well, in a way, it's really trying to produce the products that that are being sold and consumed by the public in a more water efficient way. So it's looking at the cotton T-shirt and saying, can we grow the cotton more efficiently first of all, but then also manufacture that T-shirt in a more water efficient way within the factory. So it's looking at the entire supply chain from the product produced in the field or wherever the original material is to out the factory door and reducing the amount of water that goes into that. We've had a lot of gains in manufacturing in this country from the water pollution control laws that encouraged a lot of industries to recycle and reuse their processed water internally, largely to avoid the costs of releasing that polluted water to the environment, but it's had a conservation benefit too. So there's been a lot of that gain from manufacturing, but now we're realizing we have to look at the whole supply chain because a lot of the water footprint of a cotton T-shirt or a cup of coffee occurs in the field. And so it's that entire look at things that is allowing us to get even further down this line.
You mentioned water footprint a couple times, and that's maybe a new term for folks. I mean, they're just used to hearing kind of carbon footprint now, where everything I do has a certain impact on how much carbon is emitted. Do I also need to start thinking about my water footprint on a daily basis?
It's a very similar concept, and we all have a water footprint. So the water footprint is really the amount of water that it takes to, in a sense, satisfy our individual lifestyle. The food we eat, the products we buy, the energy we use, and the water that we use around our home. So it's really those four big components. And diet is by far and away the biggest one of those. So more than half of our water footprint as an individual in this country goes to our diet. A hamburger can take 630 gallons of water. One hamburger, 630 gallons of water.
It's bad news for my son.
Bad news for a lot of us. And so, but the good news is that if we become aware of how much water is embedded in these everyday products, there's all kinds of ways we can shrink our personal water footprint really quite easily by some adjustment. We don't have to all go vegetarian, but reducing our consumption a bit of these high water items. Do we really need that 20th cotton T-shirt that took 1,000 gallons of water to make? Probably not. So it's that sort of sense that at the individual level we can focus on this. A lot of people ask me, I turn off the tap while I'm brushing my teeth. What more can I do? Well, there's a lot if you think about diet and energy. When you fill up your tank, your car with gasoline, fill up the tank with gasoline, every gallon of gasoline, 13 gallons of water. So making those connections between the products we're consuming and our everyday uses of these things and the water piece of it. And you can think about water footprint from the individual level, corporate level, city, what's the water footprint of Milwaukee? What's the water footprint of a corporation in Milwaukee? What's the water footprint of this entire country? So you can look at it at any level and see where your biggest bang for the buck is and try to shrink that. And
so it goes to, if I'm in the grocery store or I'm in the clothing store or whatever, there are choices to be made around that can decrease the water demand I'm putting on the world. So it's not that the water I'm directly using to drink or to take a shower or whatever, it's all the other aspects.
It's all of it, and even though our household use of water, which is where we most directly interact with water, is turning on the faucet, taking a shower, watering the lawn, that's an important component. Even though it may be 10% or less of your individual water footprint, it's an important piece of it because that's our local watershed. So to the extent we use that water wisely and don't waste it and make sure that we're not putting drugs, pharmaceuticals and other things down the toilet and things like that, we're protecting our local watershed. So it's important to think locally and globally, and that's one of the beauties about the water footprint concept is it helps us do that.
And you mentioned watersheds, and that for I would suppose for most people, directly or indirectly, they think something about that. If you live here in our part of the world, you know that we've got plentiful supply of water based on where we are right next to Lake Michigan, but then communities, just 20 miles away don't, and that they're facing water shortages. How how can municipalities, the big water consumers, change how they're or improve their water productivity in terms of how they manage these resources like watersheds?
Cities can do an awful lot, and we've seen some really good examples of this. Boston is one that I point to. It's not in a very dry place. Boston gets a lot of rain. But they came up against a limit that a lot of cities do, where their safe yield, the amount of water they could take out of the reservoir that supplied the city, was pretty much maxing out, and they had a decision to make. Do we divert more water from the Connecticut River and bring it to the reservoir and increase the supply, or do we do conservation? And they, at pressure from conservation groups concerned about the impacts on the Connecticut River of diverting more water, said, let's look at conservation. And they did, and within a matter of years, they were able to reduce water demand through retrofitting homes with water-efficient fixtures, education, pricing. We tend to price water quite low relative to the value of water, and then working with industries and auditing internally how they can conserve water. Boston has now reduced its water use more than 40% from its peak. And that diversion of the Connecticut River isn't necessary, probably never will be. And they've saved money at the same time, because moving water takes a lot of energy, takes a lot of money. And so it was a win-win all around. And we've seen a number of cities really take conservation to heart, not just as an emergency response to a drought, but as a long-term water management option that is good for the environment, good for the economy, saves consumers money over the long haul, and is all around a good way to go. One of the things that concerns me is this idea that every time you run short of water, you go out and look for more supply. Right. And for many cities, that next supply is desalination. Usually it's not. Usually it's conservation. That there's a lot more you can do on the demand reduction side before you really need to go to the expense and energy cost and money cost of a desalination plant. I'm not saying desalination isn't a good option. For some places it is, but I think it's that mindset shift that we need to look at our demand side and see where we can use water more productively before we assume we need to find a new source of supply.
Well, that seems almost to be an inescapable problem. So that if as we talked about earlier, we have growing demand for water because of population growth and because of need for food and need for energy. As we get to a bigger and bigger scale, so from the individual to the city to how nations or countries deal with water, how can they escape the drive to simply say, well, we'll just have to go out and get more? We do desalination, we divert rivers, we build bigger dams. How do we cope with those bigger scale demands on water?
Well, I think it is partly this shift in mindset, and I think it is partly, again, coming back to that first principle that water is what sustains all life on the planet. And so we can decide to divert to the last drop, but then what kind of a world do we have? We've decimated rivers, we've decimated wetlands, we've lost, the freshwater biodiversity crisis is extraordinary right now. We're losing freshwater species in rivers and lakes and so on at 4 to 6 times the rate as species are being lost in terrestrial or marine environments. So very, very rapid extinction and severe extinction of freshwater life. And this is the web of life. This is what keeps things functioning. We don't know how many of these species we can drive to extinction before systems start breaking down, and so I think once we begin to make that a priority, then we realize there are other ways we can meet these needs, and that is through technological solutions within factories, within farming, within cities that allow you to do more efficiently what you need to do, reducing our demand, our consumer demands, beginning to look more carefully at how much we really need to consume. If you look at a country like China, for example, most of China's new water demands are not from population growth, it's from rising consumption, both in terms of diet and consumer needs. We've had 300 million people in China move out of poverty into the middle class, which has increased their water demand tremendously. So looking at both the population and consumption side, and I think here in developed countries like the U.S., a lot we can do on the consumption side.
We have just about a minute or so left, and so Sandra, I always save my hardest question for last. So if we have this finite resource and we have this increasing demand on it. I mean, what's the bottom line for you? I mean, can we, whether it's individually in our towns and our countries, can we rise to that occasion? I mean, can we bridge that gap between how we're using water now and our demand and this finite resource?
Absolutely. I have no doubt we can do it. The question is whether we'll mobilize quickly enough to do it before we have more humanitarian crises, more tensions that spill over. The time is short to get this job done, and I think we need to begin to get the policies and economic incentives and communities working toward these kinds of more sustainable solutions very soon.
And can you say just a brief word about the Global Water Policy Project for folks that may be interested?
Sure. Independent water research and policy focus, worked with partners trying to really develop ideas and inspiration toward moving toward more sustainable water use and management.
Great. And if they Google that, they'll find your website.
Absolutely.
And they'll get
yes.
lots of great things.
Yes.
Well, Sandra Postel, thank you very much for being with us, Director of the Global Water Policy Project. And to our viewers, we'll see you next week on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website.